Martin Webb was 34 years old on the morning of April 14, 1987, when he walked into Erisman Farm Equipment in Shelby County, Iowa, and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He had $16,000 in a checking account. It was inheritance money from his mother who had died that winter. His younger brother Danny was waiting for an answer. The land was waiting. And in the back lot of that dealership, under a sky the color of dirty dishwater, sat a New Holland 8730 tractor with 420 hours on the meter. Martin had driven past Erisman's twice that week without stopping. He told himself he was just looking. But the truth was harder than that. He needed to decide what kind of man he was going to be, and he needed to decide it soon. Because Danny had already made his choice, and a neighbor named Roger Timmons had made an offer on Danny's half of the farm, and the whole thing was going to fall apart if Martin didn't move. The Webb family had owned 240 acres south of Holland since 1904. Martin's grandfather bought it with cash saved from working the railroads. His father, Howard, expanded it in the 50s, paid it down through the 60s, and held it free and clear until the day he died in 1979. When Howard passed, he left the land to both sons equally. Martin farmed it. Danny worked at the co-op in town and collected rent. For 7 years that arrangement held. Then their mother died, and suddenly there was money on the table, and Danny wanted out. Danny didn't want to farm. He never had. He wanted to buy a house in Council Bluffs and stop pretending he cared about corn prices. He asked Martin to buy him out. Fair price, clean split. Martin could have the whole farm and Danny could have a future that didn't smell like hog confinement. It was reasonable. It made sense. And Martin had exactly enough money to do it. But Martin also had a problem. He was farming 240 acres with equipment his father had bought in 1971. A worn-out International that burned oil, a planter that skipped, a cultivator that couldn't hold depth in anything but perfect soil. He was getting by, but only because he worked alone and kept his costs near zero. If he bought Danny out, he would own the land free and clear, but he would still be running junk iron, and he would be farming just enough ground to stay poor for the rest of his life. That's where the New Holland came in. The 8730 was a big tractor for Shelby County in 1987. 130 horsepower, turbo diesel, 18-speed power shift. It wasn't new, but it was close. The dealership had taken it on trade from a farmer up near Denison who'd gone in on a bigger model. It had been sitting on the lot since February. The price was $32,000. Martin didn't have $32,000. But he had 16, and the dealership would finance the rest if he put 50% down and signed his name on a 5-year note at 11% interest. What the 8730 offered was a way out of the trap his father had built. If Martin bought the tractor, he could custom farm. He could work ground for neighbors who were getting older and didn't want to keep up their own equipment. He could pull a chisel plow in the fall and a field cultivator in the spring and a grain cart in the autumn and actually make money doing it, not just survive. The tractor was a tool, but it was also a door. If he walked through it, he could be his own man. He could stay small and stay free and never owe anyone anything except the bank. But if he bought the tractor, Danny would sell to Roger Timmons. And Roger Timmons would own a third of what used to be Webb ground. And the farm that Martin's grandfather bought with his hands and his father held through the farm crisis of the 80s would be split forever. Martin stood in the dealership office and looked at the numbers Bob Erisman had written on a pad of paper. The tractor payment would be $407 a month for 60 months. That was manageable if the custom work came in. It was impossible if it didn't. Bob told him the tractor would sell by the end of the week. Another farmer from Audubon County had already looked at it twice. If Martin wanted it, he needed to decide now. Martin asked if he could think about it overnight. Bob said sure, but don't think too long. Martin drove home and sat in his kitchen and did the math 3 different ways. Then he called Danny. He told Danny he wasn't going to buy him out. He told him he was sorry. He told him he hoped they could still work something out down the road. But right now he didn't have the money and he didn't see a way to make it work. Danny was quiet on the other end of the line. Then he said he understood, and he'd call Roger in the morning, and that was that. The next day, Martin went back to Erisman's and put the $16,000 down on the New Holland 8730. He signed the paperwork. He shook Bob's hand. He drove the tractor home on county roads, taking it slow, feeling the weight of it under him and the hum of the turbo and the way it pulled steady, even on the grades. When he got back to his place, he parked it in the shed next to his father's old International. The two machines sat there side by side, one dying and one just beginning, and Martin looked at them both and felt something close to relief. 3 weeks later, Roger Timmons bought Danny's share of the Webb farm for $48,000. The sale closed in May. Roger tore out the fence row between his place and the old Webb ground and started farming it as one piece. Danny moved to Council Bluffs and bought a split-level house near the interstate. He called Martin once that summer to say everything was fine and he didn't hold any grudges. Martin said he was glad to hear it. They didn't talk much after that. Martin started taking custom work that fall. He pulled a chisel plow for an older farmer named Everett Moss, who had arthritis in his hands and couldn't run equipment anymore. He charged $12 an acre and did a clean job. Everett told 2 other farmers, and by the next spring, Martin had enough work lined up to cover the tractor payment, and then some. The New Holland ran like it was supposed to. It didn't break. It didn't complain. It just worked. But Martin learned quickly that custom farming wasn't the same as farming your own ground. When you worked for someone else, you worked on their schedule. You showed up when they called, even if your own beans needed spraying. You stayed late if the weather was turning, even if you had something else to do. And you smiled and acted grateful, because next year they might hire someone else. In 1989, a wet spring pushed planting back 3 weeks, and Martin spent 16-hour days in the seat of the 8730, running a field cultivator for 4 different farmers, who were all in a panic about getting their corn in before June. He made good money that year, but he also missed the window on his own ground, and his yield suffered. He told himself it was worth it. The tractor payment was current, and he had money in the bank for the first time in years. That had to count for something. In 1991, his father's old International threw a rod, and Martin didn't fix it. He just pushed it out behind the machine shed and let it sit. He was running the New Holland full-time now, and he didn't need a backup tractor because he didn't have enough of his own ground to justify one. He was farming his 120 acres and working everyone else's. It kept him busy. It kept him solvent. It kept him from thinking too much about the land Roger Timmons was farming a quarter-mile south. That same year, Martin started seeing a woman named Linda Schroeder who worked at the FSA office in Holland. She was quiet and practical, and she didn't mind that Martin smelled like diesel most of the time. They got married in 1992 in a small ceremony at the Lutheran church. Linda moved into the farmhouse that had belonged to Martin's parents. She kept her job in town. Martin kept farming. They were happy in the way people are happy when they don't expect life to be anything other than work. Their son Kyle was born in 1994. Martin was 41 years old. He hadn't planned on being a father that late, but Linda wanted a child, and Martin didn't have a good reason to say no. Kyle was a calm baby. He didn't cry much. He watched everything with serious gray eyes that reminded Martin of his own father. Linda went back to work part-time when Kyle was 6 months old. Martin hired a high school kid to help with fieldwork during planting and harvest. The custom jobs kept coming. The tractor kept running. By 1995, Martin had paid off the New Holland 8730. It had cost him $24,000 in interest over 8 years, but it was his now free and clear, and that felt like winning. He thought about buying another piece of equipment, maybe a planter or a grain drill, something he could rent out and expand the custom operation. But Linda reminded him that Kyle would need braces someday, and college after that, and maybe it was smarter to stay lean and keep money in reserve. Martin agreed. He didn't buy anything new. He just kept working. The late 90s were good years in Shelby County. Prices were stable. Rain came when it was supposed to. Martin's custom business grew to the point where he was booked solid from April through October. He added a grain cart to his services and started hauling corn during harvest for farmers who didn't want to stop their combines. The New Holland pulled the cart like it was empty. People commented on how reliable that tractor was, how it never seemed to quit. Martin took quiet pride in that. He maintained it like his father had taught him. Oil changes every 100 hours, grease on schedule, no shortcuts. But in 1999, something shifted. Everett Moss, the farmer who had been Martin's first custom client, died of a heart attack in his barn. His son took over the farm and bought his own equipment. He thanked Martin for his years of service and said he wouldn't be needing him anymore. 2 months later, another client, a man named Frank Oberle, sold out to a larger operation that had its own machinery. Just like that, Martin lost a third of his custom work. He picked up a few new clients, but not enough to replace what he'd lost. For the first time since he'd bought the tractor, he had open days in the spring where he wasn't working. He told himself it was fine. It was a chance to focus on his own ground, but his own ground was only 120 acres, and it wasn't enough to live on, and he knew it. In 2001, Kyle started first grade. Linda asked Martin if he'd ever thought about buying back Danny's half of the farm. Martin said he had, but Roger Timmons wasn't interested in selling, and even if he was, Martin didn't have that kind of money anymore. Everything he'd saved had gone into keeping the operation afloat and raising Kyle and fixing things that broke. Linda didn't push it. She just said it was something to think about. That fall, Martin ran into Danny at a gas station outside Council Bluffs. It was the first time they'd seen each other in almost 10 years. Danny looked older, heavier. He was working as a regional manager for a farm supply company. He had 2 kids and a wife and a mortgage and a boat. He asked Martin how the farm was doing. Martin said it was fine. Danny said he'd heard Martin was doing custom work with that New Holland and it sounded like a smart move. Martin nodded. They talked for 5 minutes and then ran out of things to say. Danny said they should get together sometime. Martin said sure. Neither of them meant it. The early 2000s were harder. Fuel costs went up. Seed prices went up. Land prices went up. But custom rates didn't, because if Martin raised his prices, farmers would just do the work themselves or hire someone cheaper. He was locked in. The New Holland was getting older. It had over 6,000 hours on it now. Things were starting to wear. The hydraulic pump needed rebuilding. The clutch started slipping. Martin fixed what he could himself and paid a mechanic for the rest. The repairs were eating into his margin, but he couldn't afford to replace the tractor, so he just kept fixing it. In 2003, Linda's mother got sick, and Linda had to take time off work to care for her. Money got tighter. Martin took on more custom jobs than he could reasonably handle, just to keep up. He was working ground for farmers 30 miles away, driving the New Holland on county roads in the dark, coming home after midnight, getting up at 5 to do it again. Kyle was 9 years old and hardly saw his father during planting season. Linda didn't complain, but Martin could see the tiredness in her face. That same year, Roger Timmons came by Martin's place unannounced. He sat in Martin's kitchen and drank coffee and said he was thinking about selling the web ground. He was getting older and he wanted to simplify. He offered Martin first right of refusal. The price was $4,000 an acre. For 120 acres, that came out to $480,000. Martin didn't have $480,000. He didn't have a tenth of that. He told Roger he appreciated the offer, but he couldn't swing it. Roger said he understood. He sold the land 2 months later to a young farmer from Kirkman who paid cash. Martin didn't tell Linda about that conversation for 3 months. When he finally did, she asked him why he hadn't at least tried to get a loan. Martin said because it wouldn't have mattered. The banks weren't lending to guys like him anymore. Small operators with aging equipment and no collateral. He'd made his choice back in 1987, and this was the consequence. Linda asked if he regretted it. Martin said he didn't know. Kyle grew up watching his father work. He learned to drive the New Holland when he was 12, sitting on Martin's lap and steering while Martin worked the pedals. By the time he was 14, he could run it himself. He was good with machinery. He had a feel for it. Martin thought maybe Kyle would want a farm someday, maybe take over the operation, but Kyle never said anything about it, and Martin never asked. In 2008, the economy collapsed, and suddenly nobody wanted custom work because nobody had any money. Martin's phone stopped ringing. He had 3 jobs lined up for spring of 2009, and that was it. He planted his own ground and then sat idle for 2 weeks waiting for work that didn't come. The New Holland sat in the shed. Martin sat in the house. Linda worked extra hours at the FSA office. They made it through, but barely. That summer, Kyle turned 15 and told his parents he'd gotten a job at the subway in Holland. He said he wanted to save money for a car. Martin said that was fine. Kyle worked 30 hours a week all summer and into the school year. He bought a used Civic with his own money. Martin was proud of him, but he also understood what it meant. Kyle wasn't interested in farming. He was interested in leaving. In 2010, Martin turned 57. The New Holland 8730 turned 23. It had over 9,000 hours on it. The engine was still strong, but everything around it was tired. The seat was torn, the cab door didn't seal right, the paint was faded and the decals were peeling. Martin had replaced the clutch twice, the hydraulic pump once, and the rear tires once. He'd rebuilt the transmission. He'd patched rust spots with Bondo and spray paint. The tractor didn't owe him anything. It had done exactly what he'd bought it to do. But it was old now, and so was he, and the world had moved on. Custom work picked up a little in 2011, but not like before. Farmers were buying bigger equipment and doing more of their own field work. The ones who still hired out were hiring younger operators with newer iron. Martin got enough jobs to stay busy, but he wasn't making any money. He was just covering costs. Linda asked him how long he planned to keep doing this. Martin said he didn't know. As long as he could, he guessed. Kyle graduated high school in 2012 and enrolled at Iowa Western Community College in Council Bluffs. He said he was thinking about a degree in IT or maybe business. He didn't say anything about coming back to the farm. Martin didn't expect him to. The farm wasn't something you came back to anymore. It was something you left. In 2013, Martin had a custom client cancel on him 3 days before spring planting because the client's nephew had bought a new tractor and offered to do the work for free. Martin didn't argue. He just crossed the job off his list. That same week, the New Holland threw a hydraulic line while he was dissing and sprayed fluid all over the engine compartment. Martin shut it down and walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and felt older than 59 had any right to feel. He fixed the hydraulic line himself. It took 2 days. The tractor ran fine after that, but something had shifted in Martin. He'd been holding on for so long that he'd forgotten what he was holding on for. The farm was 120 acres that barely paid taxes. The custom work was disappearing. Kyle was gone. Linda was talking about retirement. And the New Holland, the machine that was supposed to give him freedom, had become a monument to a choice he'd made 26 years ago when he thought he knew what freedom meant. That fall, Martin got a call from a farmer in Defiance who needed help bringing in corn. The farmer was 81 years old, and his own equipment had broken down, and he was desperate. Martin drove the New Holland 40 minutes to get there. He ran the grain cart for 3 days straight, working dawn to dusk, helping an old man save a crop he'd probably planted for the last time. On the 3rd day, while they were unloading into a semi, the old farmer asked Martin how long he'd had that tractor. Martin said 26 years. The farmer nodded. He said that was a good machine. He said you didn't see loyalty like that anymore. Martin didn't say anything. He just kept working. When the job was done, the old farmer paid him in cash and shook his hand and said he appreciated it more than Martin knew. Martin drove home in the dark with the money in his jacket pocket and the New Holland running steady beneath him. Somewhere south of Kirkman, he passed the land that used to be his brother's. It was planted in soybeans now, clean rows running to the horizon, farmed by someone Martin had never met. He didn't slow down. He just kept driving. Kyle came home for Christmas that year. He was 19 years old and full of plans. He'd gotten an internship with a tech company in Omaha. He was talking about moving there after he finished his associate degree. He asked Martin if the farm was doing okay. Martin said it was fine. Kyle asked if Martin ever thought about selling. Martin said he thought about it sometimes, but he didn't know who'd buy 120 acres with an old house and a shed full of worn-out equipment. Kyle said land prices were high right now. Martin said that was true. Kyle said maybe it was time. Martin said maybe. They didn't talk about it again. In 2014, Linda retired from the FSA office. She'd worked there for 23 years. She had a pension and Social Security, and she told Martin they'd be fine, even if he stopped taking custom work. Martin said he wasn't ready to stop. Linda asked him what he was waiting for. Martin didn't have an answer. That spring, he got 4 custom jobs. One of them was for the son of Everett Moss, the same man who'd let Martin go 15 years earlier. The son's equipment had broken down, and he needed someone to finish planting his beans. Martin did the work without comment. He charged the same rate he'd been charging since 2005. The son paid him and said thanks, and that was the end of it. In June, Martin's cousin from Nebraska came through town and stopped by the farm. They sat on the porch and drank iced tea and talked about family and weather and nothing important. The cousin asked if Danny ever came around. Martin said no, not really. The cousin said that was too bad. He said family land was a hard thing to lose. Martin said it was. The cousin asked if Martin regretted not buying Danny out back in the day. Martin looked out at the fields and the shed where the New Holland sat, and the house his grandfather had never owned but his father had. He said he didn't know if regret was the right word. He'd made a choice. The choice had consequences. You couldn't undo consequences just because you didn't like them. The cousin nodded like he understood, but Martin could tell he didn't. Nobody really did unless they'd stood in that dealership in 1987 with $16,000 and 2 futures and no way to choose both. By 2015, the custom work had dried up almost completely. Martin planted his own ground and spent the rest of the season repairing equipment he wasn't using. The New Holland had over 11,000 hours on it. It still ran, but it was living on borrowed time. Martin knew that. Everyone knew that. But he kept it going because it was the only thing he had that still connected him to the choice he'd made. And if he let it go, he'd have to admit that the choice had been wrong. In October of 2016, Kyle called from Omaha to say he'd gotten a full-time job offer with the tech company. Good salary, benefits, a future. He sounded happy. Martin told him that was great, and he meant it. Kyle said he'd be home for Thanksgiving. Martin said he'd look forward to it. After he hung up, Martin walked out to the shed and looked at the New Holland. It was parked in the same spot it had been parked for 29 years. The same shed his father's International had sat in. The same farm his grandfather had bought. But none of it was whole anymore. It was just pieces. A tractor, a house, 120 acres, no son to pass it to, no brother to share it with. Just Martin, alone with a decision that had seemed so clear in 1987 and so costly now. Linda found him there an hour later. She asked if he was all right. Martin said he was fine. She said they needed to talk about what came next. Martin said he knew. She said Kyle wasn't coming back. Martin said he knew that too. She asked if he'd thought about what he wanted to do with the farm. Martin said he'd thought about it every day for 29 years. In the spring of 2017, Martin listed the farm for sale. 120 acres, farmhouse, shed, equipment included. The realtor said it might take a while to find a buyer. The property was small and the house needed work and the equipment was outdated. Martin said that was fine. He wasn't in a hurry. The farm sold in August to a young couple from Des Moines who wanted to try their hand at organic vegetables and farm-to-table sales. They paid $280,000. It was less than Martin had hoped for, but more than he'd expected. The sale included everything: the house, the sheds, the equipment, the New Holland 8730. On the last day, Martin walked through the empty house and out to the shed. The couple had said they'd probably sell the tractor. It was too big for what they needed. Martin stood there looking at it, this machine that had defined 30 years of his life, and he felt nothing. Not regret, not relief, just a kind of exhausted recognition that it had all added up to this. An empty shed, a sold farm, a tractor that would outlive his connection to it. He got in his truck and drove to the house he and Linda had rented in Harlan. It was a small place. 2 bedrooms, a garage, no land. Kyle came home for the weekend to help them move the last of their things. He asked his father if he was okay with all this. Martin said he was. Kyle asked if he'd do anything differently if he could go back. Martin thought about that question for a long time. Then he said no, probably not. You make the choice you can live with, and then you live with it. The young couple from Des Moines sold the New Holland 8730 6 months later at a consignment auction in Carroll. It brought $4,200. A farmer from Cass County bought it to use as a backup tractor. It's still running. Martin is 71 years old now. He and Linda live in town. Kyle works in Omaha. He's engaged to a woman who grew up in Lincoln and has never set foot on a farm. They're planning a wedding for next spring. Kyle asked Martin if he missed farming. Martin said sometimes, but not the way Kyle probably thought. He didn't miss the work. He missed the idea that the work meant something permanent. Danny retired last year. He still lives in Council Bluffs. He and Martin talk on the phone every few months. They're polite. They ask about each other's health. They don't talk about the farm. There's no point. The farm is gone. Roger Timmons is dead. The land their grandfather bought is split 6 ways now, owned by people with no connection to the name Webb. It'll keep getting split until it doesn't mean anything at all. Sometimes Martin drives past the old place. The young couple planted heirloom tomatoes and built a farm stand out by the road. They seem happy. The New Holland is gone, but the shed is still there. So is the house. So are the fields. They just belong to someone else now. Martin doesn't stop. He just drives past and keeps going. The same way he kept going in 1987, when he chose a machine over land and thought he was choosing freedom. He knows now that freedom wasn't what he bought. What he bought was 30 years of work and a tractor that outlasted his claim to it, and a farm that got sold to strangers because there was no one left to pass it to. He doesn't regret it. Regret implies you had a choice you understood. Martin had a choice, but he didn't understand it. Not really. Not until it was too late to matter. He bought a New Holland 8730 because he thought it would let him be his own man. And it did. But being your own man turns out to mean being alone with the consequences. And consequences don't care what you thought you were choosing. They just care what you chose. The tractor is still running somewhere in Cass County. The land is still there south of Harlan. And Martin is still here, 71 years old, living in a rented house in town, carrying the weight of a decision he made when he was 34 and thought he knew what mattered. He knows now, but knowing doesn't change anything. It just makes the silence louder.